人でいるとたまに不安になるの。いつかアルハザードを手にした自分が闇に飲まれてしまわないか。私リコリスでもボーゼルって呼んでもいいの？リコリス頑張る。私に任せて。一緒にかくれんぼしない？
Hey everyone, this is Nitro. In this video, I am going to be talking about the way to build Licorice or Licorice, depending on where in the world you come from. Also referred to as Loli Bozel, of course. So as always, I'm going to start off by covering a summary of Loli Bozel. And her basic role, it contains two main aspects. The first part is that she is a new dark faction buffer. So that is a nice advantage to have, and she is quite useful as a result. But other than being a dark faction buffer, she is also an AoE attacker who can carry two AoE skills, both of which are incredibly useful. So this makes her very PvP oriented as a result. Other than this, the other aspects of Licorice that must be considered is that first, she must be 6 stars to be used properly. What I mean by this is that because of her talent, if she's not at 6 stars, she's actually not that great. Okay, more on that later when I cover her talent. And the other part of that is that her talent allows her to do some terrain modifications with her AoE and her support skills. Okay, so this AoE terrain modification will apply additional effects for either healing your characters or doing damage to the enemy. So it's multi-purpose. She also has access to surprisingly tanky soldiers, which makes her very, very difficult to one-shot. And finally, worth mentioning is she also has the mass heal skill. So she can actually make a surprisingly decent healer, even if you don't get a primary healer. Kind of similar to, let's say, how Deedlit makes a surprisingly useful healer, even if you don't have another healer. Licorice is pretty much the exact same. Alright, so now let's move on to talk about Licorice in detail, okay? So Licorice is part of the following factions: the Dark faction, which she's the faction buffer for, the Princess Alliance faction, which has Luna and Shafino as faction buffers, and she's also part of Ares' new faction. I can never remember the name of that faction, so I'm just going to call it Ares' faction. Realistically, the only faction buffs she would get then would be either Dark, which would be Bozel, her bringing a faction buff, or the princess ones, because Ares is usually brought with his 3C, and then you bring either a single target strike skill or an AoE attack skill, so you never bring a faction buff on Ares. Okay. Licorice's talent is Power of the Demon God, and it has multiple effects. It can be separated into 3 real effects. Okay? The first effect is that healing effects are increased by a certain percentage. Since I said that you really need Licorice at 6 stars, you can just say it increases healing by 20%. Okay? The second effect is that area of effect skills, which includes both support skills, mass heal, as well as AoEs, will cause all the targeted squares to gain the terrain effect Breath of Life for 1 or 2 turns. It only hits 2 turns at 6 stars, and it's because it can last 2 turns that Licorice really needs to be 6 stars to be used properly. If it's a 1 turn effect, then it's not that good. But the 2 turn effect can be significantly harmful to your enemy and help you a lot. And finally, the Breath of Life effect is that when friendly units move onto these tiles, you dispel 1 debuff from your characters, and they get healed equals to 1 times the intelligence of Licorice. Okay. In terms of bond requirements, her 4th bond is unlocked by Ares, and her 5th bond, the offensive bond, is unlocked by Bozel. So let's move on to talk about the maximum stats for Licorice, and her 2 classes are Devil Incarnate, which is a demon class, and the Dark Martyr class, which is a holy class. Demon classes are just too vulnerable in general to holy class characters like Yusuke, Yulia, Shafaniel, and so on, so you don't see anyone use Licorice in the demon class. And the other reason for that is because a lot of healers can also be left in their holy class, and if you're trying to attack an enemy healer in a demon class, it won't do any damage whatsoever. So all these factors combine to make it so that nobody really uses her in the demon class, so we can just skip those stats entirely. So in her Dark Martyr or Holy class, she has a good amount of hit points with 3606 base hit points, much higher than, let's say, Wilder and so on. It's not amazing compared to, you know, a lot of the infantry characters, but it's acceptable. And her intelligence is lower at 480 int compared to demon class, but she does have high magic defense and a decent amount of skill. The 117 skill is significantly higher than other characters like Bozel and so on. Okay. Finally, Licorice's Soldier Boost is very, very defensively oriented. It provides 15% hit point increase, 20% attack increase, 30% defense increase, and 35% magic defense increase. Okay. So in other words, the 30% defense and 35% magic defense means that she can be surprisingly tanky with her soldiers, making them pretty hard to deal with. Okay. So, let's then move on to talk about the Heart Bond effects for Licorice. Since you don't use her in her Demon class, I'm just going to skip the first portion and talk about just the Dark Martyr Heart Bond effects. So at the 4th level of the Heart Bond, the effect is that when attacked by an enemy with higher hit points than yours, damage taken in battle is decreased by 10%. And at the 7th level, when magically attacked and entering battle, damage dealt is increased by 10%. Then the level 10 one is all hero stats increased by 5%. So the 4th one basically means that if you get hit by, let's say, fixed damage before combat begins, you take a bit less damage. Usually that is not enough to save you, right? If you've already taken damage, you're usually a very easy kill. But the 10% damage decrease may potentially save you. You never know. As for the level 7 one, it's really not that much good, right? Realistically speaking, if you get magically attacked by an enemy, you're not going to be able to kill them with 10% extra damage on you. It's just that simple. Okay. So neither of the Heart Bonds are all that useful. Alright. So now let's move on to talk about Licorice's useful skills. These two skills on this page are the ones that you should always bring on Licorice for PvP. Okay. So there is her Awakening skill, which costs 3 points, and then the Demon God Arrival Transformation skill, which costs 1. So this uses up 4 of the potential 6 points that she has available to her. Okay. The Awakening skill, Dark Mercy, is a 5-turn cooldown skill, and the effect of it is that it deals 0.3 times damage to all enemies within 5 spaces of her, and inflicts 1 random debuff on these enemies. So the range-wise, it's just like Heaven's Sanction on Shaphaniel and Lana, or Runic Void on Rachel. Right? The other effect, though, of this skill is that all allies within range of this skill are healed by 3 times the Licorice's intelligence, and they also get 1 debuff removed from them. So it's a combo skill, right? You do damage to enemies and you also heal allies, which makes it very, very useful. And keep in mind, this skill also does combine with her talent. So her talent will then apply the terrain effects, where when your characters end their turns on those tiles, they get to dispel another debuff and heal another 1 times int. So incredibly useful. Okay. Her transformation skill, Demon God's Arrival, costs 1 and has a cooldown of 5. So not very easy to keep using, keep in mind. What it does is it converts all the healing effect increases into damage dealt effects. Okay, and then she enters the Demon God Arrival state. So when under this state, Breath of Life effects are instead Breath of Darkness, where when enemy units move onto this block, upon end of their turn, gain 1 random debuff and they take 1 instance of fixed damage, equals to 1.2 times Licorice's intelligence. So basically, her talent effect, instead of healing allies and dispelling debuffs, will now deal damage to the enemies and inflict debuffs on them. Okay. So, and the other factor of this skill is, after use, you can act again. You can't move with this act again, but you get to act again. In other words, what you can do then is, let's say, move your Licorice forward, activate Demon God's Arrival, and then launch your AoE attack, like the 3C. Finally, when you're already in Demon God Arrival state, you can use this skill to cancel the status, and then you can act again afterwards. Right? So canceling the status will convert the Breath of Darkness back into Breath of Life. Last but not least, Demon God's Arrival cannot be dispelled and you cannot be immune to it. So if you have a effect like cannot receive buffs, like from a decay AoE hit, you can still cast this skill, Demon God's Arrival, and still get its bonuses. So very, very useful skill as a result. This is what makes Licorice able to freely transform between doing extra damage and debuffing or healing up your allies. Okay. Next then, let's talk about what you would do for those last 2 points that you have, because those first 2 skills only took up 4 of her potential 6 points. So usually the last slot for the skill would be one of these 3, which is the Dark Power, Dark Dragon's Breath, and Mass Seal. Dark Power, not much needs to be said about it. It's just a faction buff, just like Bozel has a faction buff. But the unique effect of Licorice's faction buff is that when you're using a skill, damage dealt is increased by 3% for each turn of cooldown that skill has. You can get a maximum of 20% damage increase theoretically. So if for whatever reason, if someone has a 7-turn cooldown skill, they will get 20% damage increase. Realistically, most skills have a 5-turn cooldown, so you're going to get a 15% damage increase from this, right? And then of course there's the 3-turn cooldown skills, which just get 9%, so on and so on forth. Okay, so the faction buff lasts 4 turns, cannot be stacked with other faction buffs. Pretty straightforward, right? Next up is Dark Dragon's Breath. So Dark Dragon's Breath, other heroes have, like Gizaroth, for example, like I think Lambda has it. So it's pretty straightforward. It hits 3 lines in front of her with a range of 5. So a 3x5 tiles in front of her, and it attacks all these enemies, dealing 0.36 times damage. It's effective against holy units, and it also inflicts 1 random debuff on them. Okay. The last skill that I consider very, very useful would be the Mass Heal, where you can heal allies within range for 3 times the caster's intelligence and dispel 1 debuff on them. What's worth noting as well, I should very much mention, is Dark Mercy heals the exact same amount as Mass Heal. Right? Mass Heal is especially useful in large part because of its low cooldown of 1. Because, once again, her talent will apply the terrain effects with any AoE skills. It does apply with Mass Heal. So that's why this skill can be very, very useful. Last but not least, let's talk about the other skills that Licorice has access to. First of all, Licorice has only 1 single target strike skill, which is Fireball. Right? It's a standard one, extra damage to infantry, 1.5 times damage. Because she only has access to a single target strike skill, this is why Licorice is more PvP oriented. Right? In PvE content, you generally need to single target strike kill enemies. Right? Even Bozel has access to 2 of them, right? Bozel can bring his faction buff, he can bring Dark Reaper, and he can bring Fireball for 2 single target strike skills with the faction buff. Since Licorice only has a single Fireball skill, she really is not intended for use in PvE content as a result, right? So, interesting point to note, she can only launch single target strikes with skills every other turn. 2 other skills that are actually useful on Licorice occasionally is Mass Protect and Resist. Okay. Mass Protect may have utility simply because it can apply the immunity to cannot be healed on your allies. Right? Lots of characters have issues, when you're facing off against, let's say, Yusuke, right? Yusuke applying a cannot be dispelled, cannot be healed effect on your tank can cause you to lose matches. So Mass Protect may have the occasional use, even though I placed it in the other skills section. You generally do want someone else to bring a Mass Protect rather than Licorice, but sometimes you may be forced to bring it. Okay. As for Mass Resist is immunity to stun, immunity cannot be buffed, and immunity to mobility reduction effects. May also potentially have use. Okay. The last 2 skills, Retribution and Holy Shield, in my opinion, are utterly useless. Okay. Retribution, it's useless because it's a self-targeting skill with only 2 span. So the range is so tiny that I don't feel it's a good skill at all. As for Holy Shield, right? Holy Shield is a passive that increases your magic defense. Since Licorice is not magic defense based in the first place, it's not much use. Okay. So those are Licorice's skills. Right? 1 single target strike skill, a lot of AoE skills, some of which are support, some of which are AoE damage, and 1 is an AoE heal, Mass Heal. Okay. So now let's move on to talk about the Hero Awakening materials that you need to build up your Licorice, because you're going to need these materials in advance. So for the first Awakening, you want 8 Barrier Crystals and 8 Creation Crystals, right? Of course, 5 Splendid Stardust as always. Not too much needs to be said about that. You can just farm up these materials in advance so that as soon as you get her, you can start awakening her. As for her second Awakening, the second Awakening uses 5 Eternal Moon Splendors, 12 Pure Molten Hearts, and 12 Pure Shining Hearts. Right? It's usually the second Awakening materials that you really need to farm for, because 12 of them, each one, is kind of time consuming to get. Alright, so with those things mentioned, let's now talk about Licorice's soldiers. So Licorice has access to 7 different soldier choices. Of those 7, I would actually say 4 of them are truly useful. Maybe 5. 2 of them are utterly useless. Okay, so the 2 that are utterly useless in particular are the Vampire Bats and the Wizards, which I have listed in the bottom right. Wizards because sorceresses are just better in almost all situations, and Vampire Bats are useless because they offer no real survival advantage whatsoever. Right? If you're going to run melee soldiers on a mage type character, you want something that increases tankiness, survivability, and Vampire Bats do not do that at all. The last soldier I have listed in the other soldier section is the Leviathan, which may have occasional use. It's not a soldier I would recommend you build for her specifically, but if you have them built up at level 10 already, you may consider using them for Licorice in certain battles. Specifically, battles that have water terrain and that you will leave Licorice standing on water. Okay. In those kind of situations, these Leviathans will have extra defense, because aquatic units get extra defense in water. And they would also have plus 45% attack increase when attacking. Now, in general, I still don't feel that they're her best soldier choice, but they are an option in those situations. Okay. So, other than those 3, her 4 more useful soldiers I have listed. And the first one, I consider her bread and butter soldier, would be the Crystal Warlocks. Okay. Crystal Warlocks are surprisingly tanky and hard to deal with. They make it very, very hard to one-shot a holy class or mage class character. So that's why I have Crystal Warlocks listed at the top. In addition to that, when they're taking action, you restore 30% of the soldiers' hit points. Okay. And finally, when they're forced into battle, they can reflect 30% of the damage back to the enemies. So this damage reflection may potentially allow Licorice to actually kill enemies that attack her at 2 range with counterattacks. Worth noting. The second soldier worth using on her is actually the Bishops. Okay? So the Bishops are meant for a very specific build of Licorice, where you're focused on maximizing your hero's healing effect increases. So Bishops also increase the hero's healing effect by 15%. Right? So it stacks with her talent, with her AoE heals, and so on. I've been informed that actually, when you use her transformation skill, Demon God's Arrival, to turn everything into fixed damage, it seems to kick in with healing increases. So that's an interesting thing to note. I'm not entirely sure on this, but that's what I've been told. So that's why bringing the Bishops will both increase her ability to heal, or if you transform her into the damage dealing state, it also increases the fixed damage that is dealt. Not 100% sure on that one. So you'll have to try it out if you manage to build 2 sets for her. Okay. Finally, worth noting for Bishops is that as long as their hit points is above 80%, their defense is increased by 30%. So they're actually quite hard to kill with physical attacks when fully leveled up. Assuming you have a strong holy trading ground upgrades as well. Okay. So that's why Bishops are useful. The third soldier choice for Licorice is the Sorceresses. So Sorceresses do not offer much survivability, right? We all know what Sorceresses do. 45% attack and magic defense increase as long as they're at full hit points. They have high damage, but the reason Sorceresses are useful, despite making Licorice vulnerable to getting one shot, is that Licorice inherently can fly in her holy class. The Dark Martyr class can actually fly. This means that if you bring the Sorceresses soldiers, Licorice becomes a flying character, because she can fly and her soldiers can fly. So you're giving up survivability for the ability to fly. Whether that's worth it is kind of up to you. It may have the occasional use. Okay. And finally, the last soldier that I consider potentially useful for Licorice is the Tide Elves. Like Leviathans, they only work on certain maps that have lots of water. Okay, the reason Tide Elves are good though is because even though they only have one range, unlike all her other soldiers that I mentioned, which have two, they reduce physical damage by 45% as long as they're in water. So this can make her ridiculously tanky against physical attacks, and that's purely why the Tide Elves are good. Important to note, Tide Elves do not get physical damage reduction. Sorry, they do not get magic damage reduction, right? So running Tide Elves may potentially make her vulnerable to magic attacks. Just something to keep in mind. Alright, so in conclusion, Licorice's soldiers are very dependent on the equipment that you build for your Licorice. Okay, more on that coming up in the next page. So, the reason why her soldiers are dependent on the way you build Licorice is because depending on the way you build her, she may have very different roles. Okay. For the first set that I have listed here, it's healing oriented with a healing style enchant. Okay. The second set is pure AoE damage focus. The third set is a balanced set, which would provide both healing and AoE potential. And then the other set would be gear that everyone should have access to. It's not ideal gear for her at all, but maybe you just temporarily want to use Licorice for a certain fight or whatever. You would just throw in this common set that almost everyone should have built up. Okay, so let's go into each set in detail. First, the healing set. So the healing set is primarily intended to go with using the Bishop soldiers to maximize your amount of healing effect increases. So as a result, you're going to run the Enchant of Crystal for that 20% as well. Goddess's left hand provides 15%, and then Goddess tier provides, I think, another 15%. So in total, you're looking at 15% from Bishops, 20% from the Crystal Enchant, 15% from Goddess left hand, and another 15% from Goddess tier, which gives you 65% additional healing effects, which is very, very high. Right? So that's, at its basis, that's how it works. Tenyo's robe for the armor, Tenyo's headdress for extra buffs on your allies would round out that set of gear. The AoE style Licorice uses, in my opinion, uses the Clock's enchant. Okay. You may choose to maximize the damage, maybe bringing something like magic, for example, but I feel Clocks is better because if Clocks activates, you get to launch more AoEs. Right. So with this set, you're going to want a Miracle Staff for the weapon slot and a Vidar's Rose for the accessory. So Miracle Staff has a 30% chance to apply additional debuffs on enemies, while Vidar's Rose can dispel buffs on them. So that stacks out very well with her launching out AoEs. For the armor, I would say you continue to want Tenyo's robe, and the helmet, I put in the Soul Stealer headdress here for potentially silencing enemies, but you can always use a Tenyo's headdress as well. This is more, the Soul Stealer headdress in my opinion is more if you don't have quite that many Tenyo's headdresses, then you would use the Soul Stealer headdress instead. Next up is the balance set. So the balance set allows you to play both roles, right? Let me just mention, first of all, for the AoE set, you generally want to bring Dark Dragon's Breath, the Awakening skill, Dark Mercy, and Demon God's Arrival. So in that sense, the AoE set is very, very oriented towards just launching out AoEs, right? If you need a faction buff, someone else should be providing it to her, such as Bozel, right? Or such as Shafaniel and Luna. So that's how it works. So in some ways, you're limiting your roles, but you're making her much more powerful in that intended role. The balance set then is more middle of the line. You can run healing, you can run AoE, you can run healing, you can run AoEs. I still recommend the Clocks enchant because Clocks is just so good for any AoE attacker. And the set focuses on increasing intelligence rather than healing or AoE damage. Right? So that's why you have the Red Moon and the Star Earring. Okay. So the Star Earring and Baldur's Right Robe combination would allow Licorice to potentially one-shot counterattack anyone that attacks her, right? And also survive assassin strikes, right? So the Star Earring offered a 30% defense and magic defense increase, can increase her survivability significantly. The Baldur's White Robe would make it so that when she gets melee attacked, as a lot of assassins do, she has a 30% chance to do full damage to those enemies. Tenyo's headdress continues to be the best in slot for the headgear slot, providing buffs and so on. So with the balanced set, going back to the skills selection again, right? You can run, let's say, the faction buff, you can run the mass heal, the Dark Dragon's Breath, you can rotate between all three at will. There's no recommended skill selection in this situation. That's not to say AoE can't run those kind of skills as well, worth mentioning, but AoE is configured more for double AoE in general. And finally, the other set is just not recommended, as I previously mentioned. It's more just a set of gear that everyone most likely has built in one form or another, right? So Blue Moon, Galaxy Cloak, Dark Crown, and Drop Near, because all of these items you can get from clearing. So finally, the final thing to talk about here is the class mastery enchants for Licorice. So for class mastery enchants, there's nothing too special about her because she doesn't require a specific, she's just a general mage, right? She's intelligence based. So for the armor headgear slots, you're going to want hit points, defense, and intelligence, right? Defense would increase your survivability against assassins. You could also choose magic defense, but I think defense is more important, okay? For the weapon and accessory slots, you want the standard intelligence, hit points, and skill, right? Getting that extra 40 skill from these two slots will basically provide protection against Omega, so it's important to get. Okay. Finally, as for the arena slots, my recommendation is hit points, defense, skill, intelligence, and finally the damage reduction on crit hits. So those would be the 5 stats I suggest you increase, because once again, offers the best combination of survival against assassins and being able to do damage and so on. So now let's show some examples of Licorice in action. And Licorice was used a lot in the Chinese server Season 4 playoffs. So this first battle has the following party facing off against each other: Juggler, Waller, Rean, Licorice, Liana, against Landius, Claret, Liana, Deedlit, and Bozel. So player 1 clearly has an AoE oriented party, while player 2 has the Tank Buster Claret comboed with a single target striker Deedlit and Bozel for support, either AoEs or sleep and so on. So let's take a look and see how this battle plays out. Alright. So initial setup configuration. Here we see Licorice activate her Demon God arrival state, so that she's going to be doing damage to the enemies rather than healing to allies. Waller provides Strengthen to Rean, and Liana provides Gospel to Juggler. Player 2 initially maneuvers forward a little bit, getting into position. Meanwhile, player 1 continues to hang back. Right? So right now, player 2 has put Juggler into range of Claret to be potentially struck. It's an interesting thing to see. So, meanwhile, player 1 continues to activate effects, and there we just saw Licorice step into the air, right, with the Sorceress Soldiers. Meanwhile, Rean activates his transformation skill as well. And now, so we see Rean is in his transformation state, and it'll last for around 3 turns. So now Waller activates High Stakes. And meanwhile, player 2 continues to hang back. So, player 2 is hanging back in large part because he knows Claret cannot two-shot the enemy juggler. And now, at this point, Licorice launches out her first AoE. Right? So that's the Dark Dragon's Breath. It hits the enemy Bozel, and it hits Landius. And you can see the terrain effects that it applied. Following up with that, Juggler now jumps in. So, teleport. And he does some nasty damage to Bozel, Landius, and Deedlit. Deedlit then provides Sea of Miracles, gets some healing in, and then does not attack. So now Licorice launches out her second AoE. A lot of damage once again. And Liana moves in to provide some healing, taking a bit of fixed damage as well. So we're constantly seeing a lot of characters take a little bit of fixed damage from the terrain effects. And next, Rean jumps in, launches his AoE now. So, 3 AoEs, but most of the characters have survived. Barely survived, but they're still alive. And that's in large part because of the healing effects from... Yeah. It's worth noting though, look at that. Deedlit, Infantry's Deedlit, only had 526 hit points. But also worth noting is all those debuffs on these characters. You know, Liana cannot be healed, and so on and so forth. So, Landius takes the fixed damage from the terrain effect, and I think he had a burn effect on him. So now Rean launches out another AoE, kills off both Bozel as well as Deedlit. And Liana is both silenced and cannot be healed, right? So Liana is also a dead character, and thus player 2 gives up right there. It is worth noting though that in this particular example, player 1 had no real faction buffs for his party, right? Instead, he used Strengthen on Waller and used Liana with Gospel to provide stat boosts to his characters. So it's an interesting factor. What's worth also mentioning is that this is actually a semi-finals match on the Chinese Android server. So this is a very much a top level match. And yeah, despite that, he didn't have a faction buff party set up. The second battle I'm going to go over is actually the third match of the semi-final match that I had previously covered. So player 1 lost the second match and they went into round 3. And for this round 3, player 1 does not bring Juggler anymore. He instead has Landius as his tank. He's bringing Rean and Licorice yet again. And for his healers, he's using Deedlit and Iris rather than Waller and Liana. As for player 2, Landius with Gizaroth, with Waller, with Yusuke, and Deedlit. So once again, it's an AoE assault team versus a more single target strike build team with Gizaroth to provide a faction buff for Yusuke. So let's get started. Alright, so as usual, with the start of these battles, you're maneuvering your party forward, getting them into range of the enemy. So that's what we're going to be seeing at the start. Both sides maneuvering to get their characters into range to fight. So once again, Licorice activates her Demon God Arrivals state. Kind of interesting there because you can use that anytime. So I am kind of surprised he's using it right at the very start. Nonetheless, party starts moving forward. Both characters activate their transformation skills. Okay. Licorice, then Rean. Yusuke moves up, activates his transformation skill as well, and Deedlit Gospel is used on Rean to prepare for AoE attack. Iris maneuvers forward. And next, Landius uses his Peace of Mind. Gizaroff in the meantime, dropping a summon, and teleportation of Licorice forward. So now Licorice launches Dark Dragon's Breath. And what's noteworthy here is we just saw that 2 debuffs have been applied on various enemies, right? For example, we see 2 debuffs on Yusuke, right? Cannot be healed as well as, you know, Deedlit gets silenced with 2 debuffs, right? So the 2 debuffs means that Licorice 100% has Miracle Staff in this case. Fortunately, Waller was able to remove those, and now Rean jumps in and launches his AoE. Really doesn't do much damage to Landius because it's infantry against cavalry, but Yusuke in particular has been knocked down a lot at this point. Right? Yusuke's in serious danger of dying, and he can't even heal still. Sea of Miracles. And then Gospel on Yusuke. Deedlit taking quite a bit of damage from the Rean debuffs. In the meantime, right, Deedlit now acts to buff up Licorice. So now Licorice, second AoE, boom. Down goes Deedlit, and surprisingly Yusuke lived. Oh no, Yusuke doesn't live. Yusuke dies. He just lived long enough to activate Gizarov's faction buff. That was what it was. And then the Gizarov's construct is also demolished at this point. So right there, player 2 has no choice but to surrender. So the second match played out very similar to the first one in terms of having an AoE assault strategy that crushed player 2's party. However, it was slightly different because player 1, first, he definitely got lucky with the way Miracle Staff activated and applied certain debuffs on the enemy characters. But at the same time, it just shows how powerful this AoE assault strategy can be with the Miracle Staff build when properly utilized. This next battle shows the round of 32 to the round of 16. And this fight has player 1 bringing Landius, Listel, Waller, Iris, and Yusuke, while player 2 has Landius, Bozel, Licorice, Ares, and Waller. So in very many ways, player 2 has an even more powerful party than those semifinals match, right? Because there's Bozel for faction buff and AoE, there's Licorice for double AoE potentially, there is Ares for AoEs, and Waller is here to provide his high stakes healing, while Landius is the tank. So let's get started on this one and see how this particular fight plays out. Player 1 initially holding back a bit, right? Not moving Landius whatsoever, while player 2 is the one who has to advance. Transformation for Licorice. Transformation for Yusuke. Oh no, sorry, faction buff for Yusuke. Transformations after that. Bozel activates his faction buff, so yes, Licorice has the double AoE build ready. And Ares just maneuvers forward a little bit. Waller doesn't activate his high stakes yet. So now, Landius, Peace of Mind. Other Landius starts moving forward. So player 2 clearly has to make the move to attack. Especially with how far back player 1 is really holding. So this is interesting. So what we just saw was Licorice actually chose to bring Mass Protect instead of a second AoE. So she used the Mass Protect and buffed up all the characters, and we also saw the tile effects kick in. So Mass Protect, I suppose the main reason for Mass Protect here was to protect Landius from Yusuke, so that Landius can heal after Dark Tinker. So the battle continues. And Iris uses Le Jardin de Iris on Listel. Interesting. And Ares just moves back a bit. So both sides continue to act. Licorice is sent forward and triggers the enemy Listel to launch Mind Bore. And then at this point, Wilder finally activates her high stakes. And what's worth noting there just now is Wilder moved into the tile effect. But because Licorice had previously activated the Demon God Arrival skill, Wilder didn't get any healing there. So once again, I am kind of surprised that player 2 keeps activating the Demon God transformation as soon as on turn 1. Because sometimes you may want to keep it so that you can have your characters heal from instead of doing damage right away. At least that's what I feel. In any case though, battle continues. Bozel charges forward, launches Sleep on Listel so that Listel is knocked out, right? After Listel has acted. So she can't do anything the next turn. So very smart use of Sleep there with Bozel. And now Wilder tries to mass heal, but that sleep can't be dispelled. So Ares is now able to charge forward. So that means on this turn, here we go, AoE Assault. Licorice, 3C, right? Massive terrain effects, we see some fixed damage apply on the enemies. Mass heal is used to heal them up a bit. Bozel launches his AoE, Black Hole. More damage to all these enemies. Iris starts providing healing, but cannot be healed was applied. So Landius can't heal. And we saw, fixed damage effects on Iris and I guess poison. So she took double fixed damage impact. Dark Tinker, but since Licorice had applied Mass Protect, Landius is not affected. And now Ares comes charging in, uses his 3C, uses Noble Charge, and hits Landius, taking out Landius for the first time. And then he activates the 3C AoE, and just like that, Iris is killed, Wilder is killed, and there's just 3 characters remaining. So just like that, player 2 has taken out both healers of player 1, and it's currently 5 against 3. And then, in fact, Landius comes charging in and attacks and kills off player 1's Landius. So it's now 5 against 2, just like that. So I'm just going to stop this play here at this point. Battle's clearly over. They'll have to play it out a bit more. But 5 against 2, there is no comeback from this. The final battle I'm going to demonstrate is a quarterfinals match. The top 8 moving to the top 4. And for this particular battle, both sides have Juggler. And both sides actually have Mystery Knight as well. So player 1 has Juggler, Mystery Knight, Deedlit, Chloe, and Rachel. Whereas player 2 has Juggler, Mystery Knight, Wilder, Bozel, and Licorice. So let's get started on this battle. Player 1. Okay, what's interesting to note is player 2 brought Stone Colossus on his Juggler for reduced damage from Mystery Knight. Player 1 has the standard Lobsters. Neither side has very much faction buffing, although player 2 has an advantage there because he has Wilder for strengthen potentially, and he has Bozel and Licorice for a faction buff combo. So now Licorice moves forward a bit. Strengthen is used on Mystery Knight. And player 1 starts retreating back a bit. Licorice activates Demon God Arrival transformation. And Juggler activates Triton. Clearly, player 1 is just holding back, trying to avoid, while player 2 is getting ready to launch a push, it looks like. So there's the faction buff. Took a while, and player 1 charges in with Knight of Mysteries and fails to kill. 36 hit points. Barely survived with the Stone Colossi soldiers and so on, but he did live. So it shows that the combination of Stone Colossi and really made a difference there in keeping Juggler alive. Right? Also, of course, this Juggler also had surprisingly high magic defense, which made a difference. Juggler is able to tank the Knight of Mysteries assault, even without high stakes. So now high stakes is activated, Juggler has the extra, I guess, 20% reduction on damage received. And what's interesting there is worth covering again. One moment. This is very much worth covering again. Licorice used her 3C skill to provide healing to Juggler. Very interesting. Because Juggler was so heavily damaged, player 2 chose to have Licorice 3C to heal. Unfortunately, he did use Demon God Arrival earlier yet again, and so the talent effect is not going to provide any healing to the characters. So now, we also see that Wyler got healed by Licorice's 3C as well. So it actually healed two characters, Wyler and Juggler. So now, player 2 begins his attack and starts everything off with Bozel launching out an AoE. What's worth mentioning here is player 1's party is actually all magic damage except for Juggler. So Bozel does not have to be very afraid of any of these enemies, and that's probably why he sent Bozel that far forward without worry. So now Bozel charges in even deeper, launches out Sleep attack on Knight of Mysteries, and also Soulstealer Headdress silence Deedlit, which is a very nice advantage to have. Licorice now jumps in with White Dragon Breath to AoE damage the enemy. And now Juggler actually brought a faction buff. Interesting. I'm not sure I agree with the faction buff, bringing the faction buff on Juggler, but in any case though. Gospeling up and holding back as far back as possible with his characters. Licorice now moves in, single target strikes down Deedlit, who is already damaged. Aurora Ring is now used by Chloe, and meanwhile, player 2 strengthens his Knight of Mysteries in preparation for an attack. So I feel like the difference is really starting to show in terms of faction buffing and strengthening and just general effectiveness overall. Player 2 having Wyler making a big difference because he's not afraid of single target strikes that way. So Rachel just jumped in but failed to one-shot, which just shows how tanky Licorice is. And then Knight of Mysteries chooses single target strike Rachel but fails to kill her. Meanwhile, Juggler Takes another hit from Rachel. And now Knight of Mysteries launches out a single target strike, kills off Rachel, finally. Player 1, Knight of Mysteries, kills off the Juggler. So battle is still actually kind of close at this point. Player 2 has lost one character, Juggler, his tank, while player 1 has lost two characters, but still has Juggler. So both sides are now activating healing and faction buffs and getting their characters ready again to do further combat. And in fact here now we just saw Bozel activate his faction buff as well, refreshing it for Licorice and himself. Battle could still very much go either way, it looks like. Thunder Zone, get some AoE damage in, but Juggler is providing healing, keeping the characters healthy. And now, the central terrain is getting seized, right? To protect the characters and keep them alive. And now Knight of Mysteries got silenced. So, by taking hold of these center tiles, Chloe had no choice but to suicide. And then Knight of Mysteries was killed, making it so that player 1 only had Juggler left. And so player 1 surrenders at that point. So overall, that was quite an interesting battle. The most unique point of this particular fight was seeing Licorice's 3C be used to provide healing to her allies instead of doing damage. Because we always think of her 3C as a damage dealing skill, but it does provide healing too. And it can be used defensively like that to heal up your characters. So thanks for watching everyone. I hope you found this video useful to you. And on that note, Nitro out.